There are pools everywhere as we take a look at a new system today. Hello, and thank you all for joining us again here today on Hudson County for another SRD talk. Today we'll be taking a look, as you can see up there, the Moxie Toolkit by Oddity Press. This system was originally created by J.D. Maxwell for their Gimwild RPG. The actual Moxie system and everything have been published under Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license. And I believe actually a number of other things created by Oddity Press have also been published under that particular license. So it's something you might want to check out if there's anything of interest you might want to see. There's a toolkit, which you'll find links to below, but also there's been created essentially a Mini-Moxie, which is like a very, very brief synopsis of the system, as well as an actual PDF version of the system itself. A lot of these, as well as additions, expansions, alterations, utilizing the system to tell different kinds of stories, like I say, a Star Wars story, have been done by the itch user Groov, who is not J.D. Maxwell, but Groov also actually recently hosted a Moxie Jam. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get this video out in time for that, but I tried. I don't know much along the lines of the specifics, but the impression I get is that J.D. Maxwell has kind of disappeared from the internet, unfortunately. And so Groov and a number of the people in the community are kind of like keeping this system and Gimwild itself kind of alive as an engaging system. So, what exactly is Moxie attempting to provide players? The system itself reports to try to emphasize cinematic gameplay, narrative collaboration, and character growth. It primarily tries to do this by utilizing a low math sort of opposed pools single roll dice system. So basically, whenever people are rolling dice, quite frequently it's the players who are rolling, not the game master, and they are rolling two different sets of pools that are acting against one another. The system also mechanically encourages the GM to respond to player-read narration by providing them tools that can try to help when things get stuck or stuff like that happens. So let's take a look at some of the basic mechanics that are helping this happen. As I mentioned, the players are frequently doing a lot of your rolling. The action roll is the way that this is most commonly happening. In this action roll, oftentimes your players are rolling a pool of d6s. The highest die in that pool determines the results based on the chart that you'll see here on the rough chart you see here on the screen. So if you roll 2 or more d6s in your pool, if you roll 2 or more 6s on the dice in your pool, then you'll get like a success with some extra benefit. Rolling at least 1 6 gets you success without any sort of consequences as intended. If your highest die is a 5 or a 4, then you have a messy success. So this gets you some sort of trouble or consequence, often a minor consequence, while rolling a 3, anywhere between a 3 and a 1 is a grim. So this is basically, again, you're failing and you're also gaining some form of consequence. The pool is built from the character's ability scores, which in this game are called stats, and which can range anywhere from 1 to 3. But also you can end up rolling extra dice because of assistance you're getting from other players and spending an in-game sort of currency that the players can potentially gain over the course of play called sparks, which gives you extra dice. Now, as I mentioned, there's an opposing pool, and those are referred to as thorns. So if your basic pool of d6s is your character's efforts to try to accomplish the action, then the thorns are the difficulties that are standing in their way. You could potentially roll anywhere between 1 or 2 dice in this thorn pool, and thorns are always d8s. Whenever the player rolls a 7 or an 8 on any of those d8s, then the player is cut, which means basically the success result goes down 1 step. So if you rolled going back to our other chart, if you rolled a perfect, then your perfect becomes a messy. If you rolled a messy, then your thing becomes a grim. Now, one other thing to note is that, of course, if you rolled a grim and you get cut by a thorn, then that actually reduces your grim to what was referred to as a disaster, which means there is a very big consequence, and also this is one of those situations where you can potentially gain sparks. Two other things that are important to note here is that criticals are generally immune to cuts. And then finally, if you ever were to encounter a situation where for some reason you need to roll 3 or more thorns, either because of stacking outside consequences impacting your roll, or like let's say you have some sort of harm or some damage to your character that is making you roll thorns. 3 or more thorns means the action is generally considered impossible. There are some small situations where I could see potentially doing 3, but 4 is right out. So that's kind of how these opposing pools are kind of working against each other. And this is for your basic action roll. So this is the dice pool roll style that your players are going to be using most frequently whenever they're attempting actions. There are actually a couple of other ways that the Moxie system utilizes dice that also still contributes to this intent to try to create a system that embraces the narrative. One of them is this concept of using montage rolls. So this is whenever your characters, of course, are doing a series of things, and either the individual consequences of each step of the process does not necessarily really matter all that much, or you just want to get through something really quickly. So in this particular type of a situation, you just have each of the players roll a 2d6 and then add them together. At least each player involved in the montage, and then basically compare that to yours in order to figure out what exactly the outcome of the montage is. Another method is using diminishing pools. This might be somewhat familiar to some people. Basically, this is utilizing a dice pool and kind of like eliminating dice as you go in order to try to track the use of a resource, time passage, effort, and progress on challenges. So this allows you to track those and essentially a clock without, but still having some sense of randomity to this. So we've seen this in a couple systems before. In this particular instance, basically, you would be utilizing anywhere between 4 and 8 dice, depending upon the length of the clock that you want, and then basically you drop everything that rolls a grim, or anything between a 1 and a 3. There are certain special rules that are mentioned in the booklet that I'm not going to bother touching on like what you do if like you're, especially when you're like towards the end and you roll but the dice isn't dropping. There are certain ways that you could potentially force it to drop even if it hasn't yet. Finally, there are story rolls. This is essentially this system's oracle for whenever like the GM needs to decide how something turns out, but they don't necessarily want to kind of do it themselves. They want some randomity to that. So what they would do is you would roll anywhere between 1 to 3 dice, depending upon the general odds of a good outcome. Or a specific outcome that your player might, or your GM might be thinking of. And then, of course, again, you're using that perfect, messy, grim system, where, of course, perfect is, yay, everything comes out exactly the way you intend or expect. Messy is it's kind of a mix, and then grim, of course, means that something's gone sour in some way. Now, of course, all of this talk about rolling dice and stuff, we of course need to think about the consequences of your actions. This Moxie system has a sort of layer of different types of consequences that could be potentially impacting your character. In part, this is in order to make sure that the consequences of whatever actions are happening are impacting the actual mechanics of the game, which of course is good, but also these different layers give you different ways of embodying different narrative consequences in mechanically as well. So this going a bit further than the way some other systems might. At least some simpler systems like this might. Whenever your character does an action and could potentially suffer some form of like damage or consequence to themselves physically or mentally as a result. There are two different types. You basically have marks and you have harms. Marks are intended to be minor temporary setbacks. So, for example, like you might have strained a muscle or twisted your ankle, like got a minor sprain or something like that. Something you can kind of walk off, or you'll be fine in a couple minutes. All of these marks and harms are directly done against the stats that your character has. Again, remember your character has these stats that are affecting your pools. So basically what will happen is that whenever your character gets a mark, you'll essentially mark one of your stats. The next time you use that stat, you get one thorn against that roll, in addition to whatever all else might be attributing thorns to that particular action. So it's just for the one roll, and then the mark goes away. If you have one mark on a stat, then the stats are in pairs, where you have two physical stats and two like mental stats. If I already have a mark on one of my mental stats and I get another mark, then I would just get it on my other mental stat. And then if both of the mental stats already have marks and I get a third mark, then that turns into a harm. Looking at harms, basically whenever your character does end up suffering that a significant consequence, your character becomes either bloodied or rattled. Bloodied, of course, meaning you have suffered some form of physical injury or something. Rattled, meaning that something has really shaken your confidence or your mental abilities in some capacity. Like, unlike the mark, which only attributed a +1 thorn to just rolls using that stat, harm gives you a +1 thorn to all rolls that your character needs to do. And it doesn't go away until the harm goes away. You can get bloodied, you can get rattled, right? But if you get two harms of the same type, then your character drops. Basically, this is the equivalent of like your character being knocked out of play in a lot of other systems. And what you would typically do is you do a story roll, which again is referring back to that oracle, to determine your character's fate. Usually you would roll a 2d6 and then you figure out, like, if it's a grim, then your character potentially dies. If it's a messy, then maybe your character gets a condition, which we'll discuss in just a moment. And then if it is a perfect, then you're just kind of like knocked out, and then when you get up, you'll be fine. Not fine, but like you're still harmed, but you're not like, obviously you don't have these significant, potentially severe long-term consequences. Conditions are some form of malady or injury. They also, just like harms, contribute a +1 thorn. However, conditions are typically, they can last a long time or a short amount of time, depending upon the type of condition and how the player and the GM are describing it. But the important part is that unlike harms, which impact everything your character does, conditions only impact certain things. So an example of a condition might be, for example, let's say my character ended up becoming significantly harmed because they were exposed to a lot of, I don't know, mold spores while adventuring in a mushroom patch, some sort of weird magical mushroom patch that was causing the spores like get into your lungs and actually harm your character. So maybe they have some sort of like asthma-like condition that can last for a while, but maybe eventually goes away. Again, these could be short-term or long-term things, like a broken bone versus like an actual like permanent, somewhat permanent disability. Although it's important to note that this system does specifically say that like if a condition were to be permanent, then the player needs to make that decision. Needs to at least agree to that. The last consequence that we see here that might sometimes pop up would be becoming vexed. Basically, something happens that causes your character to experience an intense, extreme emotion that in many ways drives their actions for at least a couple of story beats. Again, depending upon what type of emotion this is or the situation or whatever, this can potentially cause your character to either act out of character or act in a way, not necessarily out of character, but like not necessarily act in a way that would be rational, because again, they're experiencing extreme emotions, right? Like extreme anger or something, or something else along those lines. Extreme fear. This could potentially require the player to roll a thorn if the character is attempting an action while being vexed that causes that tries to act against the emotion that they're currently experiencing. Being extremely angry about something but needing to try to like calm and focus on something, like some sort of intellectual task, when you're already feeling incredibly emotional about something, obviously that's a very difficult thing to do. So these are all the different consequences. On the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what are the ways that the system allows you to treat these consequences, because there are so many different kinds. So marks, again, as I mentioned, the negative that comes from a mark only affects the next roll that uses that stat. So again, it only lasts for the marks all go away whenever you do that roll or whenever your character rests. You can't use any sort of like mechanical healing process in order to try to get them to go away, because the idea is that marks are kind of temporary anyway, so let's not make it too easy for them to go away. Harms will eventually heal themselves with either rest or treatment, but they use a D4 pool to track the amount of time that they have remaining. So each time that your character gets a chance to rest, which again, this is a mechanical term, think of this as being like a long rest in D&D. Or you're gaining some, or you are able to use some form of mechanical process, like or maybe there's some sort of magical story device within your game that allows you to potentially heal. That could be considered a treatment. And then you would roll your pool. Again, you eliminate, just like we had with the diminishing pools we described earlier. And then once that pool, of course, hits 0, the harm is healed and it's erased from the character sheet. You can also remove harms by taking downtime. So downtime, of course, would be like an extended period of rest, where like you're talking about multiple days, and that basically, whenever your character is doing downtime, things advance in the world, and then also like all marks and harms go away, and some conditions may potentially as well, depending on the type of condition. Conditions, again, it depends, because again, as I mentioned, it could potentially be even permanent if the player agrees that this is a good thing for their character to have based on the story and everything going on, or they could potentially resolve like a mark or harm or some other process. It depends on the negotiation between the GM and the player when the condition is first created. Like it could be like a harm, but maybe has a longer pool or something along those lines. Vexing, that really just goes away after 1 or 2 story beats. So maybe a couple of rounds of action if you're having to track that within like combat or some other process like that, or maybe just at the end of the scene or in the next scene or something along those lines. So not very long. So again, Moxie is a system that's intended to be more narrative focused. So there are a couple of tools that are given to both the players and the GM in order to try to influence, to a certain extent, the mechanics to best fit the way that they feel that the narrative should flow. There are a number of systems that we've discussed that do also use things like this, like story points and stuff like that. But the way that Moxie does it is players can have the ability to get sparks. I briefly touched on this earlier when we were talking about rolls, because one of the main ways that you utilize sparks is you spend sparks in order to gain an extra die whenever you are doing an action roll. These are actually earned by voluntarily adding a tangle to the play, which is some form of like more medium to long-term consequence for your character. Like your character might not necessarily act in their best interest because that just fits the character. If your character ends up rolling a disaster because of Thorns knocking down their roll, that's another place where they can potentially earn sparks. And then also your characters can earn sparks by resolving a story arc. So basically managing to finish a portion of the story, or a quarrel, which is a special mechanic that this Moxie system has where you're having a dispute with another PC. Basically, whenever that happens, all of the players involved either roll 2d6s And you can't have more than two characters involved in the situation. Every character who's in, then the out whoever gets the best result is the outcome. You could of course have characters supporting other ones, or you can have like multiple parties each with their own point of view disagreeing with each other. Whichever one comes out on top is the one that's resolved. Again, obviously characters could be a bit bitter about the outcome, but all of the players need to agree that whatever is the result, end result is how things are going to come out in the story. Um, and as a consequence of this quarrel, all of the participating players get a spark. The GM also has essentially a form of currency that they refer to as suspense. So suspense is essentially earned by the GM by the GM might, in some instances, hold back whenever there should be a consequence potentially impacting a player character. So, for example, if my player character rolled a grim on an action, then clearly there needs to be some sort of consequence there. But if the GM just can't think of anything, or if it feels better narratively for them to just hold back on that and maybe have something pop up later, that might just make more sense. It's also possible for the GM to decide that there just needs to be a turn in the story for cinematic effect. Like the players are all stuck and they can't figure out how to solve a problem. The GM could basically give them some sort of situation that helps them resolve the problem, but in exchange gets suspense that they can then use later. Basically, this suspense currency then, in turn, is used in order to basically add trouble to a situation without a trigger. So there might be a situation where something is happening and the GM decides, okay, I'm going to use my suspense to make something happen here. Without me having to have had a player fail a roll or something in order to have this thing happen, like having more characters, more adversary NPCs join the situation, join the scenario, join the fight or whatever. The NPC does something that causes the player to get a thorn on this next roll. And also, it's generally suggested that, like, whenever the players are potentially encountering some sort of major adversary or something like that, that the GM basically has 1 to 2 suspense automatically just because of that encounter to be used in that encounter in order to make this consequential character even more significant for like the big bad or whatever, to make them more significant and consequential for the players in resolving. Now, building a character. Whenever you are intending on building a character, the first thing you will typically start off with is by picking a background. The background is just basically the basic description of the origins of your character. What did they do before they became an adventurer with this group or whatever it is? This does help when it comes to dictating whatever advantages your character might have. And by that, what we mean is advantage is typically used whenever the GM and the player are thinking about the consequences of or not consequences, but thinking about the difficulty of a particular action. So, like for example, if I'm a teacher, then there are certain situations where I might find things really easy. All right. In which case, if it's a given, then maybe my character shouldn't actually roll at all, even though a typical player might. While there are other situations where my character might have an extreme difficulty in doing something because they don't have the skills or the training or whatever in their background to really likely be good at doing this thing, like surgery, for example. Another thing that your character will typically have is 3 traits, and you'll notice that there is, for traits, desires, and features, we have 3 of each of these things. For the traits and desires, what we're doing is we're describing 2 things that your character is, or 2 things that your character wants, and 1 thing that your character isn't, and 1 thing your character does not want. So that's something interesting to sort of add some tension there, and also to describe some things, not only things that are positive about your character, potentially negative. Finally, yeah, again, those 3 features, these are typically like your character's outward description. As I mentioned earlier, your character also has stats that help dictate your dice pools. These particular, the standard system has 4 stats, so we have 4 dice pools. Each of these has a rating between 1 and 3, meaning that the pool associated with that stat starts off with either 1, 2, or 3 dice. Um, when with a max of 8 dice spread across all 4 stats. So you could have just an even spread of 4 or 3, 1, 2, 2, or something like that. The standard descriptions of the 4 stats is brawn and agility, those being your physical stats, and wits and presence being your mental stats. And again, remember, whenever your character suffers harm, it's either harm to basically one thing or the other thing that has that impact. Your character also potentially has bonds. The basic sort of system doesn't necessarily describe very much about the bonds, other than that these are relationships with other characters. So like it doesn't say how many bonds you should have, like whenever you first create your character or whatever. But anyway, bonds are essentially the description of a relationship between you and another character, at least from your character's point of view. So bonds do not need to be two-sided. Bonds also don't need to be equal when it comes to the way that you feel about the other character. So, for example, you could have two player characters who have a bond with each other. One character could think of it as being like a very positive, growing friendship, while the other character might think of this as being like a rivalry. And the tension between the differences of those two bonds can cause some interesting play in the story as well. Finally, characters will also typically have talents. Talents are and each character will typically start the game with 2, with the possibility of buying more with XP and stuff like that. Games might want to use paths in order to try to organize the talents and make it easier to pick, since oftentimes you'll have a big long list. So, for example, you might have like a fighter path, or a rogue path, or a cleric path, or but anyway, no matter what, each of these basically gives you certain special abilities, um, or gives you certain bonuses when you're doing certain things, in order to make certain elements easier. Here's an example of one where it's Scholar. So Scholar says you gain 2 Academy specialities as traits. Take one, uh, add one die to your pool whenever you're adding details with them. So basically, like so essentially what this does is it gives me certain specialities that if I'm utilizing those specialities as a part of my traits, then I get extra dice. There's one here called Issue Command, right? Where it says twice per session you can issue a command to assist an ally without any risk, because normally when you're assisting an ally, you do take on the risk of helping them. If the individual you're assisting follows the order, then they can also ignore 1 thorn of consequence, 1 thorn from the roll as well. Oftentimes, they'll either allow you to ignore certain things, certain negative things, add extra dice to pools, remove thorns, or like that issue command, they might give you certain special abilities. Some abilities also come with pools. So, for example, in some of the examples that they give you Mini-Moxie, one of them is called Chemist, which gives you a chems pool that you can actually use to help you do certain things whenever you're utilizing your chemistry skills. Basically. One thing that we didn't specifically mention on this slide that is important for characters but isn't really involved in the building of them is, of course, character advancement. Your characters typically advance by gaining experience points at the end of story arcs, which may be at the end of every session or so on. Whenever there's a particularly impactful session, maybe the GM might decide to give you an extra XP. So essentially you're gaining between 1 to 2 XP per session or maybe per story arc. So essentially what you're doing is you're marking down how many experience points you gain. Once the number of experience points you gain equals your next level, then you move up to that level, and you are allowed to add a new trait to your character, or a new talent rather. Because you are gaining a new talent with each level you gain, the system does generally recommend that characters only really go from level 1 to level 7. So does Moxie provide the players with these things that we have here, our cinematic gameplay, our narrative collaboration, and our character growth? I would say yes. Um, it would be interesting, I think, in order to introduce maybe some other ways for character growth, but there is a basic advancement system. We do certainly have cinematic gameplay because, again, our players are encouraged to do things that are difficult. They have tools that allow them to make difficult things a little bit less difficult sometimes. And also, finally, the use of pools and the use of suspense for the GM, the encouraging the use of suspense for the GM does allow the GM to create cinematic elements when required, and generally to make it less nitty gritty and more sort of focused on the feel of everything and the appearance of everything, and less so on the again the sort of nitty gritty, realistic, sort of simulationist style play. We do also have an encouragement for narrative collaboration, a number of things like getting into tangles, the way that quarrels are set up to work. We are definitely encouraging narrative collaboration through the mechanics, for sure. So yeah, I feel that Moxie could certainly be an interesting system. I do hope to maybe dive a bit deeper into it and learn a bit more about it. Because I'm actually seriously considering maybe using this to help power a system that I'm developing, a game I'm developing rather. Grimwild is a fantasy game, but I could definitely see this system also being really useful for things like historical dramas, where again the emphasis is on the sort of cinematic storytelling and less so on the simulationist realism. I could see this being a very useful system for also, again, more of like your space opera sort of style science fiction. Resistance play, I could see this being really useful for resistance play, especially if you're really smart and careful about the way that you're utilizing marks and harms. Um, I feel like depending upon how you tune the difficulty, Moxie could be really brutal. um, which in some ways could be a positive thing if you have a dark system, but also can be tuned the opposite direction as well, where it make it a bit easier, make it a bit simpler, make it a bit cleaner and brighter when it comes to like the feel of both the situation and also the mechanics and how impactful they are on the players and the characters. Um, so yeah, I feel like this is a good system that could go either way, depending upon how you tune specifically what you're given here and what other stuff you might layer on top. Anyway, that was Moxie. As I mentioned, there was a Moxie Jam that by the time I get up this video is probably already over, but I'll put a link in case there's some, because there's a good list of different tools and resources that Groov had kind of put together for the people being involved in that jam. I'm also going to put a link for the actual PDF version of Moxie, the Moxie Toolkit, which is a website, and then also Mini-Moxie, which explains many of the core basic rules, 1.5 page format, and also, of course, gives you a character sheet as well. So, thank you all for joining us again here today on Hastings County for another SRD talk. Again, there's a whole playlist of these videos if you'd like to take a look at any of the other systems or system reference documents or generic TTRPG systems that I have created videos on so far. Don't forget to like and subscribe, of course, if you'd want to see more TTRPG systems and other discussions. And don't forget to rate your itch purchases and have a good zone.